You are looking at 5 everyday foods that, if stored correctly, will outlast your grandchildren. Not canned goods, not survival rations. Honey, salt, white rice, dried beans, sugar. Archaeologists pulled honey from a 3,000-year-old Egyptian tomb, and it was still good. But here's what nobody tells you. With a single oxygen absorber and a Mylar bag, a 5-pound bag of white rice turns into a 30-year food supply. And you're probably storing yours wrong right now. 5 foods in your kitchen right now were built by nature to outlast you. Honey, salt, rice, beans, sugar. Their real shelf life isn't marked on the package. It's measured in centuries if you know the one storage rule that locks out the only thing that makes food go bad. And it's not what you think. Every year, American households throw out more than 90 billion pounds of food, 40% of the entire food supply. And the number one reason people toss something perfectly edible, the date printed on the package convinced them it had gone bad. But the USDA has admitted for decades that those dates are not about safety. They are about peak quality. A suggestion from the manufacturer, nothing more. For 5 items sitting in most kitchens right now, that suggestion is off by 20, 30, sometimes 100 years, and the reason is locked inside a single scientific truth that the food industry never explains. Because it costs them money when you stop rebuying. Spoilage is simple. Bacteria, yeast, mold, they all need water. Not liquid water you can see, but water that is chemically available. Scientists call it water activity. Pure water has a water activity of 1.0. Most bacteria need at least 0.91 to multiply. Molds need 0.8. Drop the water activity below that line, and nothing grows. Ever. Honey sits at around 0.6. Below 0.6, it is naturally too dry and too acidic, with hydrogen peroxide laced through every drop. Archaeologists pulled sealed jars from Egyptian tombs. Honey still golden and sweet after 3,000 years. Salt is even more extreme. It pulls moisture out of anything it touches, rupturing cell walls. Pure sodium chloride, no additives, will still be salt when the sun burns out. White granulated sugar works the same way, binding free water so tightly that microbes starve. White rice and dried beans. If you strip the storage down to one rule, live and die by a number, 10% moisture content or less. Keep them there, sealed away from the air you breathe, and they remain edible for decades. The U.S. government's own emergency food guidelines list white rice as stable for up to 30 years when packed with oxygen absorbers in airtight containers. Dried beans have been opened from sealed buckets after 25 years, cooked and eaten with zero loss in safety. And yet, your bag of rice, the one you rolled down and clipped with a chip clip, has already lost the war. Because the real enemy is not bacteria or mold. The real enemy is the air that enters every time you open the container, bringing moisture and oxygen with it. The clock starts ticking, and the fixing is so easy, so absurdly cheap, that the fact most people don't know. It tells you exactly what the food industry wants you to keep doing. But before I show you the exact materials and the single $5 item that seals these foods for 3 decades, you need to see what happened when one federal agency tested what you are about to do in your own kitchen. The number they got changed everything. In 1997, researchers at Brigham Young University sealed 72 pounds of white rice into number 10 cans with a little packet that cost about 11 cents. Then they left those cans on a shelf in a regular room for 30 years. When they opened them in 2022, What they found verified a truth the food industry has quietly danced around for decades. The rice was not just safe, it tasted fresh. The moisture had not moved a single percentage point past the critical threshold. The number the lab wrote down was less than zero point 0.6 water activity, exactly where it started 30 years earlier. Microbiologically sterile, edible, ready to cook. And the only thing standing between that rice and the trash your pantry would have sent it to, after 3 years, was the absence of one molecule: oxygen. That is it. Remove oxygen, you stop time for dry food. And the packet that does it, an oxygen absorber, costs pennies. So, why are almost no home cooks using them? Because McDonald's does not sell burgers that last 30 years. And a grocery chain does not build an empire on a customer who visits once a decade. But before I show you exactly how to apply this to every one of the 5 foods on this list, you need to understand the quiet war between what science knows and what your kitchen has been told. And the first casualty of that war is honey. Honey is a paradox. It is a saturated sugar solution speckled with hydrogen peroxide and gluconic acid. Its pH sits at 3.9. That is the acidity of orange juice left in the sun. And yet, bacteria cannot touch it. The reason is osmotic pressure. Every drop of honey yanks water molecules toward itself so violently that any microbe attempting to drink will dehydrate and die. The ancient Egyptians knew this, not as chemistry, but as gift. And in 1922, when Howard Carter cracked open Tutankhamun's tomb, they found jars of it, darkened, yes, crystallized at the bottom, but chemically identical to what you spread on toast this morning. The National Honey Board will tell you, quietly in a footnote on their website, that a Best By date merely reflects optimal clarity. The honey does not expire, but the industry selling you clover honey in a plastic bear will not volunteer that fact. Because liquid honey, the clear golden version, is a manipulated product. It has been filtered and heated to delay the one thing that scares the average buyer: crystallization. And crystallization is not spoilage. It is the glucose molecules simply dropping out of solution and binding together. Crystallized honey is still safe. You set the jar in warm water. It melts back. But the marketing departments know you will toss a grainy jar. Buy a new one because hardened sugar looks wrong. So they pasteurize it, strip the pollen, and slap a date 18 months out to keep the cycle spinning. Salt is even more blunt about its immortality. Pure sodium chloride does not support life. It never has. It never will. Microorganisms cannot grow on it, and in it they die. The only enemy salt has is moisture and the iodine some brands add. Iodized salt has a clock because iodine slowly oxidizes into a form your thyroid cannot use. After 5 years in a damp cabinet, it is just salt again. Fine as a preservative, useless as a dietary supplement. But pure sea salt, kosher salt, pickling salt, stored dry, will sit in your cupboard forever. The USDA explicitly exempts plain salt from expiration labeling requirements, and yet walk down the spice aisle and every box of Morton's has a date. Why? Because a package without a date looks incomplete to the shopper conditioned by decades of dairy and meat. The date is not for you. It is for the retailer's ordering system, and nobody is going to correct you if you assume it means poison after it passes. Now, rice and dried beans, 2 pantry workhorses that the U.S. government itself has classified as survival staples. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, publishes a guide for long-term food storage. In it, white rice stored in airtight containers with oxygen absorbers in a cool room gets a rating of up to 30 years. Dried beans, the same conditions, 20 to 30 years. That is not a typo. That is the government quietly admitting what every food scientist in America already knows. Dry, sterile, oxygen-free equals nearly immortal. The problem is the packaging you bring home. The thin plastic bag from the supermarket is a sieve. It breathes. Every fluctuation in humidity, every warm afternoon, every cold morning, tiny amounts of moisture seep through. Not enough to make the rice wet, but enough to gradually push the water activity over zero point 0.6. Molds start to germinate. Lipids oxidize. The rice does not rot so much as stale into a faintly musty shadow of itself. The beans get hard, suddenly need hours of extra simmering, and at that point the average person decides dinner is ruined and drives to Chipotle. But here is the thing nobody tells you. Those same bags of beans, if you had taken 5 minutes when you first brought them home from Kroger, would still be soft cooking 20 years from now. All you missed was a Mylar bag and an oxygen packet. And that brings me to the food that breaks people's brains. Sugar. White granulated sugar, the kind you measure into cookies, has an indefinite shelf life. The Utah State University Extension, in a bulletin that reads like a message from another dimension, states that commercial sugars have an indefinite shelf life due to their resistance to microbial growth. Indefinite. Not 10 years, not 50. Indefinite. Yet the paper bag of C and H in your cabinet has a 2-year Best Buy stamp. Why 2 years? Because after that, if any moisture found its way in, the sugar may harden into a brick. It is still safe. It is still sugar. You can shatter it with a meat mallet and bake with it. But the manufacturer knows you probably will not. They know you will see a rock-solid bag and assume it is trash. The date is a self-fulfilling prophecy that turns a permanent food into a recurring purchase. So there is the line, water and oxygen. Master those two, and you possess a pantry that laugh at Best Buy dates. But if the solution is so simple, why did it take a university study opening 30-year-old cans of rice for the public to even hear about it? Why is the most practical food preservation method on Earth still treated like a fringe survivalist hobby? I want you to think about what happened in the 1980s, with something called the Mylar Revolution. Because before that moment, the technology to seal food airtight at home existed, but almost nobody owned it. And the one man who tried to put it in every American kitchen watched his business buried by an industry that did not want you to stop throwing food away. The man's name was Dr. Gerald Reed. In 1982, he had already spent 2 decades engineering packaging for the U.S. Army's meal, ready-to-eat program. He knew that a simple foil pouch with an oxygen scavenger could keep spaghetti and meatballs edible for 7 years without refrigeration. He knew NASA was feeding astronauts food, sealed the same way. And he knew there was zero reason a civilian family could not have that same security in their own pantry. So he founded a company called Survival Foods Incorporated and started selling home oxygen absorber kits bundled with thick Mylar bags. His pitch was blunt. One Saturday afternoon, $100, and you could lock 3,000 calories per day for a family of 4 behind an airtight seal that would outlast the house itself. The first year, survivalist magazines loved him. The second year, the supermarket trade journals noticed. And in the third year, retail lobbying groups began quietly petitioning the FDA to clarify that home-stored foods were potentially unsafe unless processed in a licensed facility. Nobody proved Reed's food made anyone sick. They did not need to. The threat of regulatory strangulation and a coordinated whisper campaign suggesting his pouches bred botulism was enough. By 1988, Survival Foods Incorporated had folded. Reed published one last paper in a packaging journal nobody reads, then retired. The technology did not die, it just moved into military warehouses and Mormon church basements and waited, and that is where it stayed for 40 years, while grocery chains perfected a subtler form of sabotage. In 1973, the grocery industry introduced the Open Dating Code. The stated purpose was to help shoppers identify fresh products. Within a decade, manufacturers realized a printed date on a shelf stable food had a second, far more profitable effect. It trained consumers to treat stable goods like milk. The National Resources Defense Council dropped a report in 2013 that floored everyone who read it. They found that 90% of Americans throw away food prematurely based on date labels. That is, 90% of homes discarding honey that would have outlasted their grandchildren, salt that could have cured hams for their great-great-great-grandchildren, rice that was younger in 30 years than a bag of flour is in 6 months. The report estimated American households lose up to $225 per person per month in wasted food, a figure that climbs to $165 billion nationally. And the date label system, this enormous engine of waste, is still not regulated for safety. The USDA only requires dates on infant formula. Everything else is voluntary. The words best by, use by, sell by are the result of manufacturer consensus, not science. They are marketing, and the proof is sitting right there in the government's own disaster preparedness handbooks. FEMA's guidelines, written for emergency managers, explicitly list dry rice, dried beans, sugar, salt, and honey as foods that, when stored properly, last effectively forever. The same agency that will deploy trucks after a hurricane tells you in black and white that your pantry staples are your best hedge against a supply chain collapse. But walk into a mainstream grocery store, and the shelves whisper a different story. Rotate your stock, watch the date, rebuy. The tension between what the government plans for and what the industry sells you is not a mistake. It is a business model. A family that buys one 50-pound bag of rice and stores it in Mylar ceases to be a weekly customer. A family that understands honey never expires, stops treating it like a condiment, and starts treating it like an asset. The food industry's most fragile product is your memory. They need you to forget the chemistry you already learned in 7th grade. Here is where it gets even bigger, because the 5 foods I am talking about are only the gateway. The same oxygen and moisture lockout that preserves rice for 30 years works on oats, pasta, wheat berries, dehydrated vegetables, powdered milk, bouillon, spices. With a one-time investment of about $40, you can convert an entire closet into a time capsule that makes expiration dates irrelevant. The Department of Agriculture's own FoodKeeper app, the digital version of their storage guidelines, quietly admits that if stored in Mylar with oxygen absorbers at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, dry pasta lasts indefinitely. That is not a survivalist blog. That is the USDA, and almost nobody searching for a recipe on their phone stops to scroll that far down the screen. But there is one catch. Because everything I just described fails instantly if you make the single storage mistake that almost everybody makes on their first try. And the consequence is not a slightly stale bean. It is a bag full of food that stays dry but becomes so hard you could break a window with it. Or worse, a bag that puffs up and introduces a smell you will never forget. The Amish do not make this mistake. The military does not make this mistake, and in the next part, I am going to walk you through exactly what it is, why it happens, and the ridiculously easy fix that takes less than 90 seconds. The mistake is skipping the freeze. Every pound of dried beans you bring home is carrying more than protein and fiber. It is carrying weevil eggs, moth larvae, microscopic stowaways that can survive in a sealed Mylar bag for years. If you seal the beans without killing them first, the bag becomes a sealed ecosystem. They hatch, eat, reproduce, and die inside the plastic, leaving behind casings and frass, and a smell that will make you throw the bucket straight into the trash. The Amish have known this for centuries. They freeze every bag of beans for 48 hours before it ever touches a storage container. The military does the same with its field rations. 2 days in a freezer at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and every egg is dead. The beans are sterile. Then you let them come back to room temperature, spread them on a towel to dry any condensation, and proceed. That is the 90-second task you do today that saves decades of spoilage. Now for rice. The threat is different. Insect eggs are still present, so freeze it too. But the bigger enemy is oxidation. You take a 5-gallon food-grade bucket, drop in a Mylar bag sized to fit, pour the rice inside, and add a 2000 cc oxygen absorber packet directly onto the grain. The packet is iron powder that rusts instantly when exposed to air, pulling the oxygen out of the sealed environment. You press the top of the Mylar flat, seal it with a hot iron, leaving just a tiny opening, press out the remaining air, and then seal that opening shut. Within hours, the oxygen level drops below 0.1%. The bag tightens like a vacuum pack. Nothing can grow. Nothing can rust. The rice is now chemically suspended at room temperature in a dark closet. That rice is still fluffy and white 30 years later, not according to a survivalist blog, according to the LDS Church's welfare system, which has been doing exactly this for decades and has published peer-reviewed studies verifying it. Salt and sugar are even easier. No oxygen absorber needed because nothing in them oxidizes or breeds. You pour them into a glass jar or a food-grade plastic bucket with an airtight gasketed lid, and you store them where moisture cannot reach them. If you are sealing sugar in Mylar, use a desiccant packet instead of an oxygen absorber because sugar clumps when it pulls water, not when it pulls oxygen. Honey stays in its original glass jar or transferred to a mason jar if you bought it in plastic, and lives in a cool, dark cabinet. No refrigerator. No freezer. Cold accelerates granulation, turning it grainy, which is harmless but annoying. Room temperature in darkness keeps honey flowing for a decade or more, and if it does crystallize, you set the jar in hot water, and it melts back without any loss of quality. Here's the payoff that none of the date label defenders will tell you. If you apply this system once to a single bulk purchase of these 5 items, you lock in a calorie bank that inflation, supply chain collapse, and panic buying cannot touch. A family of 4 that seals 2 50-pound bags of rice, 20 pounds of beans, 20 pounds of beans, 20 pounds of sugar, a gallon of honey, and 10 pounds of salt in a hall closet has a 6-month energy reserve that cost under $150. The same grocery budget blown on processed food would last 3 weeks. And those same foods, if left in their original packaging in a pantry, would be in the landfill before the first presidential election cycle is over. The system is not speculation. It is the exact protocol FEMA recommends to state emergency managers. The same protocol that feeds astronauts and soldiers and long-haul sailors, now sitting in a 5-gallon bucket under your stairs. And there is one final detail that surprised even me. Certain honey, particularly raw, unfiltered varieties like Tupelo or sourwood, actually improves with age. The aromatics deepen, the slight water content evaporates just enough to concentrate flavors, and if kept sealed and dark, a jar of honey 10 years old can taste richer than the day it was harvested. There are honey tastings in Europe where they pour vintages from the 1960s. It is not a pantry item that degrades. It is a food that matures. The only thing holding that knowledge back from your kitchen is a date printed on a label by someone who profits when you forget it. This is not a prepper fantasy. It is the original design of dry food, preserved by every civilization before us, then quietly paved over by a packaging industry that profits from your doubt. Now you know the number that separates a 30-year pantry from a 3-month landfill. 0.6 water activity. You know the 90-second freeze that kills what you cannot see. You know that the oxygen absorber in your hand holds more food security than a printed date no government agency ever required for safety. So the question is not whether these foods last. The question is whether you will trust chemistry over marketing. If you had to pick just one item to lock away first, tell me in the comments. Honey, salt, rice, beans, or sugar? I read every single answer, and what you choose decides what we cover next. Hit subscribe, because next time I'm going to break down the one storage container most people buy that actively shortens the life of everything inside it. And when you see it, you will want to walk straight into your kitchen and open every cabinet.